Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This is part 2 of my Climate Collusion and Fraud video. In part 1, I showed that the claims of independence between the different groups plotting the global temperature data is simply not true. All of these different groups use approximately the same data and approximately the same methodology. The claims of independence between these different groups has little to do with reality. I also showed that the historical coverage of high-quality temperature data around the Earth is much too sparse to establish a credible long-term temperature record. And additionally, I showed that NASA claims that they're not tampering with temperature data to remove the warmth of the 1940s are simply not true. This is an older version of Reykjavik, Iceland temperatures, and this is a newer version. They removed the warmth of the 1940s. Now let's take a closer look at how that occurred. This ClimateGate email was sent from Tom Wigley at the National Center for Atmospheric Research to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia and copied Ben Santer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. I'm going to read a couple of key paragraphs which I've highlighted. So if we could reduce the ocean blip by say 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So these leading climate scientists from around the world were openly discussing ways to get rid of the 1940s blip, and they didn't even have an explanation for why they were going to do it. And that's exactly what they did in Iceland a few years later. They removed the warmth of the 1940s. This ClimateGate email is a smoking gun, but I'm going to get into this much deeper. Here's a graph of global temperatures from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which was widely circulated in 1974. This article from the Calgary Herald was dated July 18, 1974. Worldwide cooling trend, linked to devastating drought. The article started, Washington, droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. So 45 years ago, everything that now gets blamed on global warming was blamed on global cooling. Isn't climate science grand? Academics blame exactly the same things on global warming and global cooling. They can't lose. And here's the same story in the Lincoln, Nebraska Sunday Journal and Star. Global climate believed returning to harsher state, and it's because of this cooling trend. Now let's listen to Bill Gates explain why the exact same things are caused by global warming.
CO2 is warming the planet. And the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase. And that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. The effects on the weather, perhaps worse, the indirect effects in that the natural ecosystems can't adjust to these rapid changes, and so you get ecosystem collapses.
No matter what the climate decides to do, cooling, warming, whatever, it's going to lead to droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes. People like Bill Gates seem to be unable to understand that these sort of events have always occurred and they always will occur, and it has nothing to do with human intervention. Bill Gates likes to play God, and he imagines that he controls the universe. Now let's focus on the temperature graph. There was a lot of warming from 1880 to 1940, and then a lot of cooling from 1940 to 1970. And in fact, in this NCAR graph, 1970 was cooler than 1870. That doesn't really sound like global warming. And here's a very similar graph published by the National Academy of Sciences in 1975. It showed a lot of warming from 1880 to 1940 and a lot of cooling after 1940. This graph was only for the Northern Hemisphere because it was understood at the time that there was not enough valid data in the Southern Hemisphere to make any meaningful comparison. And if we look again at the current NOAA map of where they have daily temperature data from 1920, we can see that that's true. There's almost no data from South America and Africa. So why are they pretending that they know what Southern Hemisphere temperatures are? They do claim to have more monthly temperature data, but there's no such thing as a monthly thermometer. Without the daily temperatures available, there's no way to tell whether the monthly data has any validity or not. Now let's go back to the 1970s again. This is a temperature graph which was published in National Geographic in 1976. It showed a lot of warming to 1940 and then a lot of cooling from 1940 till the mid-1970s. And like the NCAR graph, it showed no net warming from 1880 to the 1970s. Atmospheric CO2 was increasing this whole time, but the planet was not heating up. And this spike of temperatures in the 1940s obviously had nothing to do with carbon dioxide. And now you can see why Tom Wigley wrote that ClimateGate email. They needed to get rid of the 1940s blip because it ruined their global warming theory. In this graph, I show you exactly what they did. The black line is the NCAR 1974 global temperature graph. And the red line is the current version of NASA's surface temperatures for the globe. You can see what NASA's done. They've removed the cooling which occurred from 1940 until the 1970s. Now let's look at what NASA and the Washington Post were saying in the 1970s. U.S. scientists sees new ice age coming, July 9, 1971. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, a leading atmospheric scientist predicts. Dr. S.I. Rasool of NASA says that. So NASA knew perfectly well the Earth was cooling in 1970, and if Rasool's prediction was correct, we'd be having a new ice age starting next year. Now let's look again at the current NASA graph. They've removed the cooling which Dr. Rasool of NASA was talking about in 1971. They simply made it disappear. Now I'm going to compare the two versions of the temperature graph versus historical information, and we're going to see which one of these two graphs makes sense. I've annotated some historical events on the 1974 NCAR graph. 1902, glaciers disappearing. 1922, glaciers disappearing. 1939, Greenland glacier collapse. 1963, Norwegian glaciers growing. 1973, Iceland blocked with ice. Now I'm going to show you the historical information which corresponds to these annotations. Here's an article from the Australian Town and Country Journal dated 16th August 1902. Alpine glaciers disappearing. The famous glaciers of the Rhone have shrunk several thousand feet in the last 20 years, considerably more than 100 feet a year. And over here on the right, I've annotated with this turquoise arrow the time period which the article refers to. You can see NASA shows this as being an extremely cold period. Glaciers were melting during the coldest NASA years on record. Normally we would expect ice to melt when it's warm, but NASA shows ice melting when it's really cold. Now let's look at 1922, world growing warmer. European glaciers are everywhere receding. The ice fringes of both poles are retreating. Even during the comparatively short space of time that the Antarctic has been visited by man, the ice has retired some 40 miles. So the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica retreated some 40 miles during NASA's coldest years on record. Now let's jump forward to 1939. Greenland's glaciers melting, says scientist. Stockholm, Sweden. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting, declared Professor Hans Almond, Swedish geologist. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. Now let's look at the NASA graph again. The glaciers of Greenland and Norway were collapsing during NASA's coldest years on record. Obviously this doesn't make any sense. Now let's jump forward to 1961. New York Times, January 30th, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seem to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It's getting colder. But the NASA temperature graph shows it getting warmer, not colder. Now let's go to 1963, Canberra Times. Glaciers grow in Norway. Norway's glaciers are in the process of becoming thicker again after a period of 200 years of gradually melting down. So wait a minute, in 1939 the glaciers of Norway were collapsing, and in 1963 they were growing, yet NASA shows 1963 warmer than 1939. Sorry NASA, I'm just not buying your fake temperature graph. It doesn't make any sense. Now we're going to go to National Geographic in 1976. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coast after more than 40 years of virtual absence. And the U.S. National Science Board said, during the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first, but more sharply over the past decade. But NASA has completely erased the cooling which the U.S. National Science Board was talking about in 1974. This graph is fake. NASA's temperature graph shows glaciers disappearing when it's cold, and they show ice forming when it's warm. They've developed a new form of physics. Now let's compare the historical record to the 1974 NCAR graph. They showed ice melting when it's warm, and they showed ice forming when it's cold. This was back in the days when physics actually applied to climate science. The 1974 NCAR graph matched the historical record, but the current NASA graph does not. This graph does not make any sense and does not bear any resemblance to reality. Now we're going to look at one more smoking gun of data alteration. In 1989, Tom Carl, the longtime head of NOAA's National Climatic Data Center, made these statements. Analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Tom Carl of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Carl said. Tom Carl, who finally retired shortly after President Trump took office, was saying very clearly that carbon dioxide was not controlling the atmospheric temperature. And he said that temperatures decreased from 1921 to 1979. Next, let's look at the current NOAA global temperature graph. Now they show a lot of warming from 1921 to 1979. But in 1989, Tom Carl said that that period was cooling. NOAA has altered their data to turn cooling into warming, and these dashed lines show prior versions of their data set. They keep cooling the past more and more over time. This graph shows the changes which NASA has made to their global surface temperature since the year 2000. They've dramatically cooled the past and dramatically warmed the present by more than half a degree Celsius. So now let's go back and look at this amazing graph showing agreement between 5 different independent agencies. They all show the same fake data, which doesn't make any sense: ice melting when it's cold and ice forming when it's warm. What we have going on here is collusion to support a political agenda. These scientists were openly talking to each other about making alterations to the temperature record, and that's exactly what they did. Toto has been sniffing out the fake global temperature record for the past 12 years, and he always enjoys presenting it to you. You can visit him on the web at realclimatescience.com.